All right, looking at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15. Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or our epistle. And we looked at the first two sections of that verse on standing fast and holding last week. And we noted that the word hold is neither positive nor negative, that we can hold those things which are good, which Paul was encouraging them to do, and that you can also hold to things which are bad. We noted Revelation chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, where the word hold appears 3 times, once in the positive and twice in the negative. The negative being holding the doctrine, or one of the holdings in the negative, the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which Jesus said, which thing I also hate. And so to hold just simply means to exert great strength, to grasp or to clasp onto a thing. And so we are to hold the traditions. And that's where we're starting today with the matter of the word traditions. I made mention last week, as I was concluding, as we were we got 2 bells in one is what happened to us last week. But I noted that in the very first full-time work that I had at the church at O'Fallon in Missouri, that there was a significant faction of that congregation that despised the concept of traditions, and that the word tradition was, as we might say, a 4-letter word to them. Anything that smacked of tradition was despised by them, and as I mentioned, their confusion was in the idea of tradition as opposed to traditionalism. And there's a difference between those two. Again, a tradition is neither good, just like the word hold is neither good nor bad, tradition is neither good nor bad. And I would say in some cases a tradition could be a good thing. For example, we have gospel meeting first Sunday of every October. You know what that is? That is our tradition. That is our tradition. The first Sunday of October, gospel meeting. Now, it's not a long-running tradition. It started as our homecoming. Our homecoming. It was just when I moved here, the first Sunday in October was our homecoming. And we had morning worship, had a fellowship meal, had singing, and then we were done. Well, we decided at some point in time that we would have better luck, so to speak, with our gospel meeting if we would move it from the third, I can't remember now which one it was. Lynn, one of you guys, Hugh, help me. Was the second Sunday of June or the third? I was thinking it's second. I believe it was second. But for years and years, the second Sunday of June was our gospel meeting Sunday. And as all of you know, every church has its own Sunday that we have our meetings so that we don't get on top of somebody right down the road. For example, Barn Creek, 4th Sunday of July. White House, 1st Sunday of August. They're going to have their gospel meeting. And we had our second Sunday in June. 9th Avenue was 3rd Sunday in June. Well, we moved our meeting from June to coincide with homecoming in October. But the second Sunday of June was a tradition. And it was a good tradition to have a gospel meeting on a certain time that everybody could plan around it. All right. Now our newest tradition is we've combined 2 traditions into one. We've moved our meeting to the first Sunday of October. Those are good things. We are, and I think this is a good thing. In the last 20 or 25 years, we have established somewhat a pattern of new traditions. In other words, things that we do and try to do every year. And there's nothing wrong in and of those things. In fact, I think they can be good. They serve a particular purpose. Now, if somebody was to was to say, now you have to have a meeting on the first Sunday of October, or you have to have this, or you have to have that, because that's the way we've always done it. Then that turns tradition into traditionalism. And it binds a thing that is not to be bound. Now that's where the folks where I was in O'Fallon were confused. That they thought they confused tradition with traditionalism. Now, can the church be guilty of traditionalism? Well, most certainly it can. Most certainly it can. And traditionalism is a form of, but not the same as legalism. Legalism is to put one's trust in law as opposed to putting one's trust in the one who gave the law. Many of the Jews, the Pharisees, were guilty of legalism. In other words, they had their list of boxes that they could check mark, and then once they got their boxes check marked, they were good. Now, it didn't matter if their heart was in it. As long as I got my box check marked, I'm good to go. Now, we can be legalist in that same sense too. I came to church Sunday morning for Bible class, Sunday worship, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I did all the things appropriately. I've got my boxes checked. I'm good to go. Doesn't matter if my heart was in it, or in other words, or if I was just doing it to keep somebody off my back. You see, so we can be guilty of traditionalism or legalism, but we have to resist these things. But with regard to the word tradition, looking at how Paul used this word tradition, it was obviously a good sense. It says, hold the traditions, which you were taught by word or our epistle. And I was looking at this verse, just trying to kind of dig into it just a little bit, and note the verse there at the end of verse 15. Whether by word or our epistle. Our epistle. Do you see the specificity there? In other words, not just any writing that you have received or might receive, but the writing that you receive from us. Those are the things that are to be held fast. And I think that there's a sense in which Paul also is modifying the word to himself. It says, by word or our epistle. I think he's talking about our word or our epistle. In other words, not just what you might hear, but what you have heard from us and what you have read from our hand. And so Paul is very specific about the traditions that they are to which they are to hold fast. In Matthew chapter, I think we may have mentioned this just briefly, but just as a way of reminder, in Matthew chapter 15, and verse number 2, actually we'll start in verse 1 to figure out who's under consideration here. It says, then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. He answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? And so we see a contrast here in Matthew 15 with respect to God's law and the traditions of men. Of course, Jesus went on to explain that God's commandment is that a man is to honor his father and mother. Now, what that means is he is to take care of them. That's exactly what Moses is teaching in the Ten Commandments. What God is teaching through Moses in the Ten Commandments. To honor one's father and mother means to take care of them when they are old. And Jesus says, you have established a tradition that says so long as you dedicate the money you save to the temple, you don't have to take care of your father and mother. He says, in other words, you've established a tradition that if you give so long as you give your money to the temple, to us, that you don't have to keep the commandment of God. And so he says, you've voided the commandment of God by your tradition. And so we see obviously there that tradition is used in the negative sense in Matthew 15 and verse number 2. But note also this, with regard to the traditions of men on the top of page 143. It says, note that these are traditions of men that are contrary to God's law. Of course, Matthew 15 is where we were just talking about, where in vain the end of that is, in vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. Now, note, it says, the destructionist mocks the traditions of God by placing the divinely commanded traditions on the same level as the absurd traditions of man. Now, something I want to think about here is we have to be careful, because, again, I remember mentioning this last week, that many times people will try to take the commandments of God and define them as the traditions of man. In other words, and you'll see this, for example, you see that, and I know I say you. One of the things that I have to do for House to House, Heart to Heart is when a congregation comes into the program, as a general rule, if there's any question, I have to investigate whether or not that congregation holds what we call, the restoration principle. In other words, holds to the New Testament. And one of the ways that I do that is I go to those, as a general rule, they have a website. And I'll go to a website and I'll try to find something on that website that will either confirm that they are a faithful congregation or show me that they are not a faithful congregation. And one of the things that I've seen through the years is the statement that a church says that they sing a cappella according to their tradition. Our tradition, or you'll see things such as, our tradition has its roots in the American Restoration Movement. We sing a cappella as a part of our tradition. Now, what does that say? Without actually coming out and saying it. We sing, what's that, Dane? That's exactly right. We don't do it because we are compelled by the Bible to do it. We do it because it is merely the tradition in which we were all raised. It's what we're comfortable with. You see? And so when I see things like that, that becomes an immediate red flag. They take something that has been specified by God and try to reduce it to nothing more than the commandment or tradition of men. And we can do that with any number of things, but instrumental music, again, in my experience, seems to be the one that comes up the most. That we do it by tradition, and I would say not by, and I don't use the word compulsion in a negative way, because I feel compelled to do what the Bible says, but not in a negative way, because I want to do what the Bible says because I love God and I respect His Word. So there's an inward compulsion for me to do what God says. We don't sing a cappella because that's our tradition, even though in a sense it is our tradition in that's what we always do, but we do it because God has commanded it, and not because that's where our roots, our so-called roots are. Which, by the way, When a congregation says its history or its tradition is in the American Restoration Movement, that is also a red flag. Because it says we are what we are because of the Restoration Movement and not necessarily because of what the Bible teaches. Now, do we have ties to the American Restoration Movement? Absolutely we do. But we don't do what we do because that's what the Restoration Movement says. We do what we do because it's what the Bible says. Because the Restoration Movement was an attempt to restore pure, primitive, New Testament Christianity. And so the way people say things sometimes gives away their attitude towards the commandments of God with regard to, or as opposed to the tradition of men. And so with regard to the idea of traditions, neither good nor bad in and of themselves, context must determine which is which. Now, note this, letter D, hold fast the traditions which you were taught. Taught. Says that God's commands, traditions, must be communicated. God's people are an educated or a taught people. We are a taught people. In fact, we have to be taught before we can be God's people. And by the way, that is one of the major contrasts between what it means to be a Jew in the physical sense and a Jew in the spiritual sense. The church is described as being spiritual. We are spiritual Jews, spiritual Israel, in the sense that the church is God's chosen people today. Before Acts 2, Israel, physical Israel, was God's chosen people. Now, turn with me, if you would, to Hebrews chapter 8. And show you how this dynamic works as with regard to Christianity in contrast to Judaism. Hebrews chapter 8, we'll begin in verse 10. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their mind and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. None of them shall teach his neighbor, and none his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. That pictures a contrast between what it meant to be a Jew and what it means to be a Christian. What was the process by which a human being was a Jew? By birth, by physical birth, right? And then Deuteronomy 6 teaches that parents were to teach their children every single day what it meant to do what? Be a Jew. In other words, all the sacrifices, all the feasts. Deuteronomy 6 teaches with regard to, you shall talk of them when you rise up and when you lay down and when you walk by the way. In other words, talk to your kids all the time about what it means to be a Jew. Everything that you see that pertains to Judaism, you tell your children, that's why we do this. We're Jews, and this is a part of what it means to be a Jew. But the child was already a Jew before he learned anything, right? So the Hebrews writer, which by the way is, I believe this comes from Jeremiah 31, if I'm not mistaken. The Hebrews quote is from Jeremiah 31. Let me note here. I could be wrong on that. No, it is Jeremiah 31 to 34. Okay. Whereas one was a Jew by physical birth and had to be taught how to be a Jew, Christianity is the opposite of that. One has to be taught how to be a Christian, and then born again in order to be a Christian or a child of God, or today a member of spiritual Israel. And so we see that Christianity is also a taught religion, but it's a taught religion in the sense that one has to be taught before he can be a Christian. Whereas a Jew was a Jew by birth and then had to be taught how to be a Jew. But being a Christian is just the opposite of that. So that's why it says in Christianity, you won't have a bunch of Christians being taught how to be a Christian after they've already become a Christian. You have to be taught first and become a Christian second. And so there's a contrast there between Judaism and Christianity. That's why, and the emphasis here is that Christianity is a taught religion. God's commands have to be communicated. Note the second paragraph underneath there at letter D. A failure to teach always results in a failed society. A failure to teach always results in a failed society. And he goes on to talk about the Dark Ages. I wish I had looked this up, but there's a quote that Wayne Jackson has on. I'm sure it's on ChristianCourier.com. But it describes Roman Catholicism during the period of the Dark Ages. And that description, which by the way is called, if you want to look it up, it's called The Advice of the Bishops or The Advice of the Cardinals, something to that effect. If you go to ChristianCourier.com, Wayne Jackson will have it somewhere on that website. But it makes a statement, it's the statement of the College of Cardinals to the Pope. And their suggestion or recommendation is this: we've got to keep the Bible out of the hands of the people. Because if the people get a hold of the Bible, they'll find out that a lot of the things that we're doing can't be found in the Bible. Which ultimately Catholicism remedies that through their clergy system assuming authority to do what they want, irrespective of what the Bible teaches. Does that make sense? In other words, once the Bible began to be widely available, which, by the way, they condemned Wycliffe for translating the Bible. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, they hated that man so much for translating the Bible and putting it into the hands of the people that they dug his bones up after he was dead and burned them. And then scattered them in a river, as if that was going to do something. But for hundreds of years in the Dark Ages, knowledge of the Scriptures was forbidden among the masses, so that people could exercise control, so that the hierarchy could exercise control over the masses. Whereas, look, we want everybody to have access to the Bible, right? I mean, that's what, and we want, and by the way, and we want everybody to read the Bible, don't we? We want everybody to read the Bible because the Bible is God's revelation to man on how he can be saved, how he's supposed to live before God and his fellow man. We even recognize the good that the Bible does in the lives of those who have never even obeyed the gospel. I mean, the community that we live in is about as good a place. It's as good a place as I've ever lived. I've lived in 4 different states. I've lived in about 6 or 7 different towns in 4 different states. And this is the best place I've ever lived. Let me ask you a question. Why is this the best place I've ever lived? Why? Yeah, because of the influence of the Bible. Even among those that have not obeyed the gospel or not a part of the church that's revealed in the New Testament, the Bible is still a considerable influence in the hearts and minds of those individuals, and it just makes people better. But when we start getting away from that, teaching, what's going to happen to our community? By the way, do you think that our community is getting away from the Bible? I mean, I think I can see it in the last 25 years. Has it been good for our community to get away from the Bible? Fewer than half of everybody in this county can be found in a place of worship on any given Sunday. Would you think that? Would you consider that? I mean, if I was asking you, what percentage of people in Marion County go to church at least, once a week, as they say, for Sunday preaching? We might have a pretty high number, but the actual number is less than half. In other words, we're getting away from the Bible. And it's showing up, it shows up every day in our schools, for sure. And it shows up every day on the police arrest report, for sure. And so...
You say during wartime?
Sir?
You take back during wartime, like World War II and so forth? It's probably about close to 100%.
Yeah, at one time, go back, World War II would be what, almost 80 years now? Yeah. For a brief time after 9/11, there was a resurgence in matters of spiritual nature. Of course, it was quick to forget. That's right, quick to forget. And by the way, that can happen on a national level. It can happen on a more local level. And it can happen on an individual level where bad things happen. Maybe somebody gets sick, somebody has a family member to die, some bad thing happens. Individuals get immediately interested in getting their life right, and then all of a sudden things smooth out, and then what happens? Gone again. Yeah, that's true.
They all stick together on that, but when it comes to them, I take it off.
I understand. But we would still note that the influence of the Bible in their life is a good thing. In other words, they make their communities better, their workplaces better, their schools better. And so I understand, and it's a sad situation. All right, let me go a little bit more here before we get too deep or get too far into class. Look at the bottom of page 143. There's a pattern. There is a pattern. What you've been taught, whether by word or our epistle. In other words, what is taught will be the same thing. What Paul taught in word is what he also taught in his epistles. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Paul says, says, the things which I teach everywhere in every church. In other words, Paul's preaching and teaching was consistent. He taught the same thing everywhere he went. We would also thus conclude that there is no inconsistency in what Paul wrote. What he taught and what he wrote was the same. And so there will be this a pattern. And by the way, not only is tradition a curse word to the anarchist, so also is the word pattern. In the 80s, there became a great disinterest or opposition to the concept of pattern theology. Pattern theology. Now, the Bible teaches pattern theology. And what I mean by that is, what is a pattern? Look, first of all, so we all understand, we're all on the same. What is a pattern? Something to go by. All right? And it's something to go by that no matter where you take it, what happens? Everything's the same. Everything's the same. That's what a pattern is. All right? Now, the Bible teaches pattern theology. In fact, the Bible demands pattern theology. I probably already drawn you away from it, but go back to Hebrews chapter 8. Go back to Hebrews chapter 8. Look at verse 5. Speaking of the old law, it says, which served the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle, for he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also mediator of a better covenant, which is established upon better promises. Note, Moses was given express instructions. You have been given a pattern. You take that pattern down to the people, and you build the tabernacle according to that pattern. By the way, in my daily readings, I'm in the middle, say middle, well, I guess, out of the whole book. I'm in the middle of Exodus 27 to 38, somewhere right in there, all right? Guess what I'm reading about? I'm reading about the pattern God gave for the tabernacle. I'm going to tell you something. That is about the most dull reading you'll ever read in the Bible. Except, for example, maybe some of the genealogies of the Old Testament in the book of Numbers. Now, those things are important, all right? God didn't say everything in my book is interesting. And, by the way, the pattern for the tabernacle might be interesting to some people, but it's not interesting to me. But here's what you find in that reading. Make it blank, blank, blank. Make it blank, blank, blank. Make it blank, blank, blank. How long, what color, what materials, gold, silver, linen, make it blank, blank, blank. All right? Then the next 8 chapters are, and he made it blank, blank, blank. Blank, blank, blank. And he made it blank, blank, blank. In other words, it's almost like you took 8 chapters of the Bible where it says, and thou shalt make it, and then you repeat them word for word except where it says, thou shalt make it with, and he made it. Now, again, it's not compelling reading. But what does it tell us? It tells us that Moses was given instruction to follow a specific pattern in every detail in the construction of the tabernacle. Now, if that serves as an example for us, which Hebrews says it does, should there not then be a particular pattern that we should be able to find in the New Testament that serves us in the same way that Moses' pattern served the Jews in the construction of the tabernacle? Or is it, as everybody says nowadays, Well, it doesn't really matter what you believe or what you do, just as long as you love God and you're sincere. There's no real pattern. You can do this or not do this. You can do that or not do that. Or you can do this in a variety of different ways. But it really doesn't matter because God's just all about people loving Him, and He's not really concerned about what they do. Now, that's the mindset of the world, but it doesn't conform to the pattern that the Hebrews writer said that Christianity is patterned after the tabernacle. In other words, the pattern of the tabernacle serves as a shadow, in other words, as in and of itself is a pattern that says that there's going to be another pattern in the new covenant. And so we need to hold fast to the idea of pattern theology. Because there has been given a pattern. For example, there is a pattern for entrance into the church. There's a pattern for the worship of the church. There is a pattern for Christian living. Right? There are patterns for all those things that can be found in the pages of the New Testament. If I deviate from that pattern in any way, then I've deviated from what God has given me. Now, how can I deviate from what God has given me and then still be acceptable to God? Because when I deviate from God's pattern, whose pattern am I following? Man's, or specifically even my own. I'll make my own pattern. Isn't it right? And that's what's going on. People are devising their own patterns and presenting them as if they're God's pattern. But what they're essentially saying is, well, I've got my pattern and you've got your pattern. This reminds me, Lisa, I just got my notification about County Roundup coming up in March. And there's got birdhouse competition again? All right. What if in the County Roundup birdhouse competition they were given a pattern for how those houses were to be built? What?
That's the way it used to be.
Oh, that's the way it used to be?
Everything was judged according to that pattern, how closely.
Really? I had no idea. What's that? Catherine?
I can't believe you didn't remember that.
Well, I've not been involved in the Roundup, but probably just, maybe 8-10 years. Because I've never been a part of the birdhouse judging. But I just always assumed people were free to make their birdhouse however they wanted to make it. But now Lisa says,
It is now, but
used to everybody had to build it according to the pattern, and it was judged according to the pattern. In other words, there were specific criteria set forth by which those birdhouses. Did all the birdhouses essentially look alike? Should they have?
It should have. One of them for the perch, one time used a broom handle.
A broom handle.
Instead of a dowel rod, it was a broom handle because that's what they had.
Right. But if there's a pattern, all the houses should have been essentially constructed the same. Now, they could have been painted any color they wanted, right?
No, they had to be stained. The direction was stained and varnished.
Stained and varnished, right? Could you pick your color of stain?
Yes.
Okay. So essentially all houses were the same, but there was some room for latitude, stain and varnish, whatever stain you wanted to use. But it was still obvious when you're looking at it, what you're looking at, and they all looked the same as they were next to one another, right? All right, so the pattern is important. All right, we'll start on page 144. We'll finish this lesson next week.